Well, good morning. I was going to start this morning by saying that my brain's a bit mushy today. My wife's been away in the US all week, so I've been single parenting. Then I was in Germany for a couple of days with work as well. I've had a sick baby, and I drove up this morning from London, so I was already feeling a little bit mushy before all of that. So I pray I'll be coherent, but if I'm not, then at least you know why. But it is so great to be with you, and on a morning that feels like another really significant one for this church and the mission and the calling on this church. And I understand over recent weeks you've been working through a preaching series on kingdom, and obviously Easter is now just round the corner, and the place we find ourselves in the calendar year is a really significant one too in the Christian calendar, because right now we're around 2/3 of the way through Lent. And Lent is something that is observed by pretty much every expression and denomination of Christian faith. And it's the 40 days, excluding Sundays, that lead up to the Easter weekend, when obviously we remember the greatest event that ever happened in the history of the world, with Jesus dying on the cross. And this 40-day period in the build-up, this Lent period, is generally a time for reflection, for confession, and for recommitment to Jesus. And the number 40 is a really significant one in the Bible. And the number of days that we remember Lent kind of points us towards some really significant events in the Bible. The one probably most commonly associated with Lent is Jesus spending 40 days fasting in the desert before the beginning of his public ministry. Moses also spent 40 days on the top of Mount Sinai waiting for the revelation around the 10 Commandments from God. In Genesis, we read of the great floods, and there were 40 days of continuous rain in that situation. And the Israelites spent 40 years wandering through the desert after escaping Egypt and slavery on the way to the Promised Land. And as I think about Lent, and I think about the crux of what I want to bring this morning, it's really this word provision that I want to talk about. Because if I try and summarize what Lent should really mean for us and how we should reflect in this period, it is to remember that God is a God who provides for his people. He's a God who provides for those who love him. He's a God who never, ever falls short. You know, when Jesus was in the desert and he was being tempted by Satan and he was in the blazing heat of that environment and he was fasting, it was God who provided the strength. It was the Father. When Moses was on the top of that mountain for over a month, wondering if he was going mad, it was God who provided the revelation on how his people could live in a way that would be in harmony with him. It was God who provided the water to cleanse a broken world during the flood in Genesis. And on that cross that we remember at Easter time, it was God who provided a way for his people to be reconciled with him, despite our broken nature. And I believe this morning, as you stand as a church on the cusp of another really strategic move of God, as you stand on the edge of another brave step in the seek to live in the mission that God has called you to as a church for this region, I think we should declare together that he will once again be the provider of all the things you need. As the questions come up, as the challenges come up, as the puzzles represent themselves, as mountains stand in the way, we should pray and we should know that God will provide all that you need, that he will bring water to those dry places, that water will come forth from the rocks, and that those mountains would be thrown into the sea. But for us individually as well, I really believe that God has put something on my heart for this morning around this word provision, that we should know that he is a God who always, always provides. He's a God who never arrives too late, he never falls short, he never gives up. He provides for his people. And as we read through the Bible, we see that time and time again. But there are two particular statements I want to explore for a few minutes this morning by looking at a couple of sections of the Bible. Because when it comes to God's provision, sometimes we have to reshape our thinking in order to be able to understand the way in which he does that in our lives. And the first statement I want to look at is God can provide in ways that we didn't think were possible. God can do things that are miraculous in our life to provide in ways that we didn't think were possible. But also, secondly, God can provide in ways that we didn't think were logical too. And that's just as important. But if we start with the first one, this degree of God doing the impossible in our life, sometimes we know what it is that we're seeking from God. We know what the answer needs to be, but we sometimes come to a place where we just don't really believe that God's going to come through for us in that way. And I mentioned the significance of that 40 number just a few minutes ago. And when you look at all of those instances in the Bible, there was generally a period of waiting or a period of suffering before the provision came through. Jesus was in a very real way suffering in the desert. Moses was on top of this mountain on his own for well over a month. Noah was watching the rain just come down and down and down before the answer. And the Israelites were wandering lost without a home for 40 years before they saw the fullness of that provision. And I think that sometimes in our lives, we come to a place where the weight of the wait, the heaviness of how long we've waited for an answer can blind us to the impossible thing that God is still able to do in our life. Sometimes just the fact that we've waited for a long time and we've suffered for a long time can bring us to a place where we actually don't really believe he's going to do it anymore. And it reminds me of a man called Job, who we read about in the Old Testament. And I'm just going to read the first few verses from the book of Job. I was so disorganized, I didn't even give my verses to the guys at the back, so I'm just going to read them out loud. But the first few verses of the book of Job says, "There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. And this man was blameless and upright, fearing God and shunning evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large number of servants. Job was the greatest man in all the people of the East." And the book of Job is 42 chapters long, and it's Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day, by the way, to all the mothers. I'm sure you want to get home this afternoon, so I'm not going to read all 42 chapters, but I'll just summarize what happens there. Because this man who is upright and upstanding before God has, it seems, everything. He has wealth, he has family, he has possessions, he has contentment, comfort, all the things a man could want. And over the course of the book of Job, we see this man lose everything through a series of calamities that God allows Satan to inflict on him for a period. So the house that his children are feasting in collapses and they all die. And then raiders come and steal his cattle and murder his servants. And then fire falls from heaven and kills the sheep and kills the servants looking after them too. And in what feels like a matter of minutes, he goes from a man who has everything to a man who has nothing. And on top of that, the icing on the cake is then his body gets inflicted and he starts to develop these painful sores. And we get this really heartbreaking image of Job sat in the ash, mourning everything that he's lost, covered in painful boils and just scratching away at his skin with a bit of broken pottery. It's a totally heartbreaking scene that we get. And then Job goes into this period of being tested. And we don't know how long this period was. Some scholars think it was a week. Some would say it was several years. But there's this period that he goes through where he's waiting for God to change his situation. He's waiting for the provision and the answer. And what's really admirable about Job is that he never curses God. When all this happens, his wife says, "Why don't you just curse God and die and end your misery?" But he says, what a foolish thing that would be to do. So he doesn't turn his back on God. He doesn't curse God. He remains faithful, really, in most respects. But what we see is a man who slowly but surely is losing the belief that God is going to do that impossible thing in his life. In chapter 3, he starts to mourn the day that he was born. He wishes he'd never even existed. In chapter 17, we find him preparing for his own death because he's so sure that hope is lost. In chapters 23 and 24, he's asking out loud where God is. He's wondering whether he's being heard. He's wondering why God is doing the things that he's doing. And so he never curses God. He remains faithful, really, but you can see that this is a man who is just slowly but surely losing the belief that God is going to do that thing that he needs doing in his life. But God does come through for him, and in the end, he restores Job. And we're told that he lives for another 140 years afterwards. His health gets restored. He has 3 more daughters, 7 more sons, twice as many cattle as he had before. And he lived long enough to see 4 generations of children and grandchildren. be born. But maybe some of us are in that place that he was in, where we're staring down situations that we've had in our life for a long time. And maybe years ago we used to pray, really believing God was going to move in that situation. But it's been going on for so long now that we've lost all hope. 40 years also in the Bible could represent a whole generation of a man's life. So Moses, you could split Moses' life up into 3 40-year stints. The first 40 in the palace in Egypt, the second 40 hiding in Midian, and the third 40 leading the Israelites out into the wilderness from slavery. 40 years represented like a whole generation. And maybe you feel like you've dealt with something in your life for what feels like a generation. And you're so tired from it now that you've lost the sense that God's really going to move for you there. But before God restores Job, he actually reprimands him for 4 chapters straight. And as we read it, it feels harsh. This man who's just lost everything, this man who has refused to curse God and has tried to stay faithful, he gets reprimanded by God for 4 chapters straight. And you think, gosh, this seems so unfair. And I'll just read a few verses from a section of that. He says, "Who is it that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, because I will question you and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me. If you understand, who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? On who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, and when I said, 'This far may you come, but no farther.'" It seems so harsh that he should face this reprimand from God after seemingly staying faithful. But what we see there is God's got this really fierce desire for us as his people, that we would look to him as the almighty, all-providing source of everything that we need, even when what we're staring into seems impossible, or it feels like there isn't an answer. And I really felt that there might be people here today that can sense something of this in their lives. Maybe you've been really faithful for what feels like a generation, where you'd been praying into something and believing God was going to do something in your life and it hasn't happened. And you're not cursing him. You haven't turned your back on him, but you've just felt this quiet resignation in your spirit for a long time that that's not something God's going to do for you. And if that's where you are this morning, I really want to encourage you that there is a God who laid the very earth's foundation, who set the seas in place, who put measurements in place for the earth's stratosphere. And he is a God who is on your side. And he is a God who intimately cares about the things you care about. And maybe this morning you just need to hear that again, because you've come to a place where you've just resigned. God cannot do that thing for me. He can provide for you, and he can provide for you in ways that you don't even think are possible and you could never possibly imagine. But he can, and he also does, provide for us in ways that don't feel logical too. God can take us to places that make no sense in the moment to release us into something much bigger for our lives. Jess mentioned the connection between Jesus and fishermen in her word just now, and the second passage that I just want to read is from John 21. And we read here how Jesus' disciples had gone fishing in the night, and they'd fished all night and they hadn't caught anything. And as they're coming back in the following morning, downhearted, feeling defeated, Jesus presents himself to them in verses 5 and 6, and he says, he, Jesus, called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the other side of the boat and you will find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. And this passage always blows my mind, because these guys were professional fishermen, okay? That was their job. So they went out, they fished all night, they found not a single fish that whole time. And this was their job. So they're obviously going to be in a pretty bad place coming in the morning. That's their livelihood for the day. And then as they're coming in, this dude that they don't even recognize, by the way, because this is one of the times Jesus presented himself to the disciples after he rose and they found the empty grave. So at first they don't even know it's Jesus, and he's shouting to them like, just put your nets on the other side of the boat. And I try and imagine this scene, and it must have felt like a wind-up to these guys. They've been fishing all night. They do it for a living. They know these seas like the back of their hand. And the guy says, just move your nets from this place to like 2 meters over here. It seems so illogical that God would have asked that of them in that moment. But they do it, and the result is there's a blessing there bigger than they could have possibly imagined on the other side. And sometimes God works this way in our life, and it doesn't feel logical in the moment, but we have to believe he has mapped out every step. We're told in the Bible he's seen the end from the beginning. He knows why he's taking us down certain avenues, even when we don't know it ourselves. And I had an experience like this in my life recently. I think the last time I preached here, I spoke about the fact that I was changing jobs for the first time in 12 years. And there was a period in there where I really had to trust God for what was coming. But there was an interesting part of the story even before that I don't think I have told before. And probably about a year ago to the day, I was in a job that I'd been in for 12 years, joined the company at 21, had never really looked up and had never considered any other job opportunities in that time. But I was starting to feel itchy, and I was starting to feel like, God was kind of moving me to something new, but I didn't know what that looked like. For those that don't know, I was working for a recruitment firm, an executive recruitment firm in London. And one day I heard about a job that sounded perfect for me. For the first time in 12 years, I thought, actually, that sounds like something I'd like to go and do, and I feel like I'd be really well qualified to do. And it was slightly awkward because it was a colleague of mine that was actually running the search for this person for one of our clients. So I couldn't just go and apply for the job because that would be a conflict of interest. And the search had started 6 months before this day, a year ago. And so when they first started looking for that person, I thought, I'll just wait it out and give God time to show me whether this is right or not. And 6 months went past, and in that time, I'd kept hearing across the office, we're really struggling with this. We're looking for a very specific set of skills. It's really difficult. And every time they would say it, I'd think, that's what I do. They're my skills. I do that. And it got to the point where there were jokes being made in the office where they'd be like, oh, Joe, we really just want to find someone who's a bit like you, but in another company. And so 6 months went by, and I was like, maybe I'm just not listening to the voice of God here, and maybe I need to do something. And so I prayed about it, and I reflected on it. And in the end, I decided to very delicately reach out to the client directly and say, look, I understand this has been going on for a while. You're looking for this sort of person. Would you want to have an informal conversation? And they were very excited and very keen to do it. So we met up and had a great conversation, and they said, look, we've got one candidate in the process who we're not convinced by, and I knew who he was, obviously, because it was my firm that were running it, and I didn't think he was right either. It seemed like we were all kind of moving in a good direction. They wanted to speed me through a process, and so I came away pretty excited and feeling, to be honest, quite confident this was going to be the next step in my career. And then 2 weeks of silence followed, where I didn't hear a word from anybody until I heard my colleague across the office, after 6 months, say in a Monday meeting, we finally filled that position, and they've given it to the guy that was in process before. And I was just so confused, because I knew he was wrong to start with, and I knew I was right. And I was like, God, we've been going on this journey for months now, and I'd really prayed about this, and this felt like a really logical thing to happen. If I'm honest, I was a bit frustrated at God in that time, because I felt like he'd been building me to a place where I was ready to do something new. This felt like the right thing, and then it had disappeared without me having really any opportunity, not even so much as a second interview. And so anyway, roll forward a few months, and I decided to leave the company and step into that period of just waiting and allowing God to show me what was next. And within a few weeks of leaving, a firm reached out to me, because they'd heard that I was maybe thinking about what I was going to do. And it was a very similar firm to the one that had turned me down before, but actually it was a much more prestigious firm than that. They were a top 10 global firm in that space. And the job was more interesting too. And financially, it was more interesting. And the long story short is, within a few months, I'd secured a job that was so much better than the job that I thought I'd missed out on just a few months before. And when I thought God was taking me to a really illogical place, what he was actually doing was preparing my heart for something bigger and better that he had for me just down the line. And it's so hard in those moments for us to see why God is doing certain things, why he is allowing us to go down certain avenues. But I tell you now, God does not fall short. And if you're in that moment where you just feel like, I don't know why life is mapping out the way it is, I don't know why the various bits of the jigsaw in my life feel like they just won't connect. And I don't know why, like, there was this promise made and now I'm staring into something that looks totally different. Then I just want to encourage you this morning that the story's not finished. That God isn't done with you. He hasn't given up and he hasn't let you down. And his provision is still coming because it always does for those that love him. I wonder if the band would just come back up. And I don't always feel this way when I preach, because as Katie said, sometimes I preach and I just want to teach something. But I really felt this morning that as I was preparing, God wanted people to respond to this word. And I think there are two things here. There's people here that I think are really staring into something that they'd given up on a long time ago. That they believed actually God was finished with me in that context, and God's not going to move in that situation. And I believe this morning he wants to restir faith in our hearts that he is a God that does the impossible and still can do the impossible for you. Maybe you know that you've just settled for something in your life that doesn't feel right. And I'm telling you this morning, God isn't finished with it. Maybe it's that sickness that you've carried for a long time. Maybe it's that broken relationship in your family that you just don't think is fixable because the weight of the weight has really worn you down. Maybe it's that financial burden. Maybe it's that thing that happened where you were really badly treated, unfairly treated, and there's never been real resolution. God isn't finished with that thing, even if you think he is. Perhaps it's the self-worth that you lost when that person walked out of your life. Maybe you've carried that for what feels like a generation of your life. And I believe this morning God wants to bring healing and restoration to people. And then I really believe there are people that are just staring into stuff right now that feels so confusing. It feels so illogical that you are where you are in your life. Maybe you think you've been overlooked, or that God has broken promises to you. I tell you this morning, he hasn't. He sees your life from the end, from the beginning, everything in between. And if you're in either of those camps, I'd really encourage you just to let someone come alongside and pray with you this morning. We have a team here that will be available as they always are. Sometimes it just takes the faith of another person to come alongside and stand with you and claim those promises over your life. Claim that he's not done with you. Claim that he can do the impossible. Claim that the confusion that you're staring into is but temporary because there's a bigger plan. He's just positioning the net of your life into just the right place so that he can fill it with more blessing than you could possibly imagine. That is the God we serve. That is the provider that we have access to. So please this morning, if you're in one of those places, let someone pray with you. If you're here with someone that you trust and you feel comfortable with, just ask them to do it. If not, we've got a team that are trained and are passionate about doing that. So don't miss the opportunity. We're right in the middle of Lent. It's a time of reflection. It's a time of recommitment. And it's a time where we can really lean into the ultimate provider. He provides in ways that we don't think are possible. He provides in ways that we don't think are logical. But he always, always provides. Amen.